In the fading light of Europe's longest war, entire divisions vanished, documents were burned, and orders were whispered through the static of dying radios. Beneath the rubble of cities and the silence of surrendered capitals, not every secret was buried. Some were merely sealed, catalogued under false designations, locked away in the vaults of governments that no longer exist. What followed the Second World War was not peace, but a quieter war, fought with files, witnesses, and silence. These are the stories history tried to erase, the archives of men who disappeared, operations that were never meant to be known, and truths that still echo through classified corridors 70 years later. Chapter 1: The Vanished Convoy of Operation Eclipse. On April 26, 1945, as American and British forces pushed through the shattered remnants of Bavaria, the Third Reich was in its death throes. The 30th Infantry Division of the US Army was advancing toward Berchtesgaden under Operation Eclipse, a final Allied effort to capture Nazi command centers, secure high-ranking officials, and recover strategic materials before they could be seized or destroyed by the Soviets. Among the countless directives flowing from SHAF headquarters, one stood out: intercept convoy proceeding south from Peenemünde via Innsbruck, cargo classified Omega priority, escort under command SS Gruppenführer Hans Kammler. Kammler was no ordinary officer. Once head of the SS Building and Works Department, he had overseen the V-2 rocket program and the vast underground complexes at Mittelwerk. To Allied intelligence, he represented the key to Nazi technological secrets, and, perhaps, something more elusive. Peenemünde had fallen days earlier, and the Americans feared the evacuation of advanced propulsion research that could alter post-war power balances. The convoy was last sighted near Salzburg by aerial reconnaissance, a cluster of 5 Opel Blitz trucks, escorted by armoured personnel carriers bearing no divisional markings. At dawn on April 28th, a small Anglo-American detachment known as Task Force Alder was dispatched to intercept. Their orders were to capture the convoy intact and deliver all materials to the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS. The group was led by Major Robert Hall of the OSS, supported by British liaison Captain William Harker and a platoon of the 513th Parachute Infantry. They established an ambush point along Route 305 near the village of Ramsau. But when they arrived, the road was empty. Tire tracks led into a wooded gorge and then stopped. A local farmer later reported hearing gunfire that night, followed by the rumble of engines heading toward Obersalzberg. The next morning, villagers found a burnt-out truck in a ravine, its cargo compartments sealed by melted steel plates. American engineers spent 2 days cutting through the wreckage. Inside were partially destroyed metal cylinders, each stamped with Luftwaffe serial codes and warning labels in Gothic script. Nicht öffnen, Hochdruckversuch. The truck's chassis number was later matched to a Peenemünde logistics record listing. Experimentelle Triebwerkskomponenten, experimental propulsion components. Yet, what disturbed investigators most were the human remains found nearby. 7 German soldiers, all shot execution style, their identification tags removed. Major Hall's field report noted irregularities suggesting internal sabotage or secondary engagement. But before the team could pursue the lead, they were ordered by headquarters to withdraw. The remaining vehicles of the convoy, 4 trucks and 2 half-tracks, had disappeared completely. Decades later, a declassified memorandum dated July 2, 1945, surfaced from the US Army Technical Intelligence Archives. It described a second, covert detachment moving parallel to Task Force Alder, the so-called Blue Unit, operating under an alternate chain of command, reportedly tied to the Manhattan Engineer District. The Blue Unit's mission file was sealed under Project Safe Haven, and all records of its personnel were expunged in 1947. Researchers who attempted to reconstruct the events surrounding the vanished convoy encountered a labyrinth of redactions. Operation Eclipse's final situation maps were altered to remove the Ramsau sector. OSS transmission logs for April 28-30 were missing pages. Even the name of Major Hall, the man who led the intercept, vanishes from post-war army rosters after May 1945. British records were no clearer. Captain Harker's service file was marked Restricted Special Liaison. 2. A designation used for joint atomic-related operations. A 1963. Inquiry by historian Dr. Edmund Latham uncovered that certain metallic fragments recovered from the wreck were quietly transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas, under the custody of Werner von Braun's technical group. Laboratory notes from that period refer cryptically to non-standard alloys exhibiting high-temperature resilience exceeding known V2 engine parameters. When questioned about their origin, von Braun reportedly replied, "That material is not from my team." Witness accounts collected in post-war Bavaria add layers of unease. In 1946, US Army engineer Robert Calloway recalled seeing unmarked crates loaded onto a C-54 transport at Munich Riem Airfield under heavy guard. The crates, labeled for scientific evaluation MD section, matched the dimensions listed in the recovered Ramsau report. The plane's manifest listed only the pilot's name, or Colm J. Kirkland, and the destination, Wright Field, Ohio. No arrival record was ever found. German post-war archives hold their own clues. A 1951 interrogation transcript from the Nuremberg follow-up trials mentions a subordinate of Kammler, SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Schreiber, who claimed that the missing convoy carried the culmination of our propulsion research, not a weapon, but the means to escape the ruins. He died in custody 3 days later of apparent cyanide poisoning. The file was sealed until 1989, when fragments surfaced under Bundesarchiv classification G1247. Even now, the official explanation remains vague. The convoy was lost in transit amid the chaos of Germany's collapse. But the scattered reports, destroyed manifests, and overlapping command orders suggest a different story, one of deliberate disappearance. Intelligence officers from both the US and Britain appeared to be competing for the same assets, possibly under the shadow of post-war bargaining that would later define the early Cold War satellite imagery released in the 1990s, revealed remnants of what appeared to be a buried complex in the Bavarian Alps, roughly 20 kilometers from the last confirmed convoy position. German geologists conducting surveys in the area reported elevated magnetic readings consistent with large metallic deposits underground. Excavation was denied by local authorities citing environmental protection. The coordinates correspond to a former SS research site listed in Allied records as Bergwerk. 12. The fate of Hans Kammler himself deepens the mystery. Officially declared dead by suicide in Prague on May 9, 1945, his body was never recovered. Soviet archives contained contradictory accounts suggesting he was captured near Linz. American intelligence maintained silence. In 1947, a memorandum from the US Counterintelligence Corps references Asset K, a German engineer providing technical data in exchange for immunity. The name was redacted, but adjacent notations refer to Eclipse documentation, secure at Wright. What Operation Eclipse truly uncovered, or perhaps buried, remains one of the most enduring enigmas of the final days of World War II. The convergence of competing Allied units, the disappearance of men and machines, and the systematic removal of all related documentation point towards something larger than a lost convoy. Whether it was a technological breakthrough, an early Cold War asset extraction, or the suppression of evidence too volatile for post-war politics, no record survives to tell the full story. Somewhere beneath the quiet forests of southern Germany, under stone and time, the remnants of that final convoy may still lie entombed. And until the last sealed archive opens, Operation Eclipse will remain less a footnote of history than a silent scar. A fragment of a war that, in many ways, never truly ended. Chapter 2. Ghost Station on the Baltic Coast. In the spring of 1952, when East Germany's coastline was still bristling with Soviet radar arrays and barbed wire, a group of fishermen out of Sassnitz began to complain about strange static, bursts that disrupted their radios every night at 0213. The interference came from a point, roughly 5 nautical miles northeast of Rügen Island, near the wreck of a scuttled German U-boat, believed to be U-377, sunk in 1945. At first, local party officials dismissed the claims as equipment malfunction, but when naval engineers tested the phenomenon, they too heard the same signal, a faint, repeating Morse sequence, identical each night, echoing through the fog. It's like 13, 13, 13. The transmission was triangulated, but its source lay somewhere beneath the seabed. In June, a Soviet hydroacoustic team under Captain Nikolai Varenko deployed submersibles to locate the source. They expected to find a civilian cable leak or remnants of German mine sensors. Instead, they discovered a series of metallic structures buried under 20 meters of silt, arranged in a precise hexagonal pattern. Divers reported narrow conduits leading deeper underground. The following day, all Soviet personnel involved were transferred out of Sassnitz and replaced by counterintelligence officers from the MGB. Official reports listed the incident as closed for national security. Baltic Sector 9, what came to be whispered among locals as the Ghost Station, remained a secret until 1975, when declassified CIA intercepts revealed that NATO analysts had detected identical signal bursts from the same coordinates throughout the 1950s. Western codebreakers referred to it as Signal Echo 13, hypothesizing it was a Cold War Soviet beacon used for submarine navigation. But within the files, buried under technical appendices, lay a fragment from 1943, a decrypted Abwehr transmission describing an undersea station R13 established near Rügen for communication Langwelle Versuchsreihe, long-wave communication experiments. The coordinates matched exactly. By the late 1980s, as the Iron Curtain began to fracture, East German divers attempted a private expedition. Their account, smuggled into the West after reunification, paints a far stranger picture. Beneath the seafloor, they found remnants of a concrete tunnel reinforced with steel plating and embossed with both Soviet and German markings. One recovered fragment bore the Reichsadler insignia beside a Cyrillic stencil, Objekt R13. It appeared that, at some unknown point, the Soviets had built their installation directly atop or within a Nazi facility that had predated them by at least 2 years. Documents from the Soviet Navy archive, unsealed briefly in the early 1990s, mention a Project Krug operated under the supervision of Lavrenti Beria's Ministry of Internal Affairs. Krug's purpose: utilization and continuation of captured Baltic research installations. Funding records show substantial allocations to Rügen sector communication development from 1946 to 1948, followed by abrupt termination in 1949, the same year the ghost station signal was first detected. No official dismantling order was ever issued. Western intelligence analysts puzzled over the persistent broadcasts. The Morse pattern never changed, repeating every 73 seconds, each burst identical in amplitude. No message was ever decrypted. Some suggested it was an automated frequency calibration pulse. Others believed it was a distress code from a lost German system that never shut down. But one entry in a 1960 CIA report labeled Echo 13, Technical Summary, hints otherwise. Signal repeats with intentional phase drift, consistent with manual modulation input at irregular intervals. Transmission origin unconfirmed, possibly sub-seabed relay. That same report included a line that would be redacted for decades. Audio spectral analysis reveals tonal characteristics consistent with 1940s-era vacuum transmitter arrays, non-Soviet manufacture. As the Cold War escalated, the site gained a quiet notoriety within intelligence circles. British signals officers nicknamed it the Whispering Wreck. American submariners passing through the Baltic reported equipment malfunctions whenever they neared the coordinates. The US Navy's own hydrophones recorded periodic harmonic feedback that disrupted sonar readings. When questioned in 1983, a retired Soviet technician named Pyotr Maximovich described being stationed at R-13 base in 1951. He claimed it was built on German foundations, powered by generators, far larger than necessary for mere communications work. His last assignment, he said, involved installing lead-lined shielding around a chamber that never opened. Shortly after the project halted, all personnel were reassigned to Siberian facilities and ordered never to speak of R-13 again. Satellite images from 1986 reveal an unusual heat signature at the exact site, a faint but persistent thermal anomaly, even though the installation was supposedly inactive and submerged. Environmental sensors attributed it to geothermal venting, but none existed in that region. When the Berlin Wall fell, a joint German-British research team requested access to the coordinates under the pretense of ecological assessment. Permission was denied by Russian Naval Command, citing heritage protection of wartime materials. In 1989, unauthorized divers returned, led by oceanographer Dr. Ulrich Merton. Their findings, preserved in a smuggled VHS tape later confiscated by German authorities, depict eerie footage of corroded steel doors and a tunnel sloping into darkness. At the tunnel's entrance was a plaque half consumed by rust. The visible lettering read, A13 Nachrichtenzentrale, Zugriff nur für Autorisierte. Merton's final log entry recorded a low-frequency hum that intensified as they approached the sealed chamber, a vibration that persisted even after they surfaced. 3 of the 5 divers involved later reported unexplained illnesses. One died within a year of what doctors described as severe radiation-like symptoms. When Dr. Merton's widow petitioned for the return of his confiscated research notes, she received a brief letter from the Federal Office for Radiation Protection. Materials examined, contents not suitable for public release. Further inquiry discouraged. She never spoke of it again. Today, Rügen's fishermen still avoid that stretch of sea. Locals claim that on calm nights, a dull thrum can be heard under the waves, as if some hidden machine continues to turn. Though both NATO and Russian defense ministries officially deny any installation in that sector, maritime charts still mark the area with an unassuming warning: navigation restricted, submarine hazard. And yet, one unredacted line from the final CIA summary file offers a chilling epilogue to the mystery. It reads simply, "Signal ceased December 26, 1991, 03:17 local time. That was the exact hour the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Since then, there has been only silence from beneath the Baltic, a silence that raises more questions than it answers. Did the ghost station shut down by design, or did it die with the regime that inherited it? Or perhaps, somewhere under the cold, shifting sands, it still waits, not dead, but listening." Chapter 3. The Black Vaults of Operation Harbinger. When the 3rd US Army occupied Linz in May 1945, most of the Austrian city was already a burned husk, its steelworks crippled and its bridges reduced to rubble. Yet beneath the southern railway yard, Allied investigators stumbled upon something far less ordinary: a sealed underground vault system, reinforced with steel shutters and concrete blast doors, the kind designed for more than air raid protection. Inside were dozens of metal containers stacked with precision, each marked with the eagle and swastika seal and stamped Geheime Reichssache. The discovery was logged under the Allied codename Operation Harbinger, a name that would vanish from official mention for nearly 40 years. The vaults were first inspected on May 14, 1945, by a joint team of US Army Counterintelligence Corps officers and members of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Unit. The expectation was to find stolen art or looted gold. Instead, they found documents, thousands of them, written in a strange mixture of bureaucratic German and code phrases. Many bore the signature of SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, Himmler's liaison to Hitler, and referenced Project Neumond, Ausweichlager Süd, and Verlagerungspunkte CE. The term Ausweichlager referred to alternate storage depots used in the Reich's final months, but no record of C through E existed in any captured files. According to the first Harbinger field report, the contents included correspondence between SS engineers, chemical firms, and financial institutions in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. More alarming were the attached instructions to transfer scientific personnel and archives to neutral custody under corporate cover. The implication was unmistakable. Harbinger was a post-war survival mechanism, but the full meaning didn't become clear until a week later, when US interpreters found a manifest linking several of the named companies to accounts in Zurich, accounts that would later be connected to vast sums of Reichsmarks converted into Swiss francs between April and May 1945. As investigators began to piece together the pattern, the operation took on a new urgency. By June, the OSS had assumed control from the army, reclassifying Harbinger as a Category A intelligence recovery. A secure detachment led by Captain Thomas B. Sheridan was ordered to escort the containers to a safe facility in Wiesbaden for analysis. Only half of them ever arrived. The train manifest showed 12 cars departing Linz, but only 8 recorded arrival. The rest, according to a later memorandum, were redirected under separate authority. That authority remains unidentified to this day. The missing 4 cars contained what the manifest described as Personalakten, Wissenschaftliche Gruppe 2, personnel files, names, photos, and assignments of German scientists, some already presumed captured or dead. Among them, were entries for men later appearing in American aerospace and chemical programs under Operation Paperclip. But the Harbinger versions of those files contained additional notes, instructions for post-war contact, using aliases and corporate intermediaries established in Zurich, Geneva, and Buenos Aires. Someone had been preparing not only for defeat, but for continuity. Decades later, fragments of this story resurfaced through Swiss banking disclosures. In 1997, the Bergman Commission investigating dormant Holocaust-era accounts uncovered transfers made by shell corporations registered in the names of Nordlicht AG and Helios Industry Handel, both founded in May 1945. Weeks after Germany's surrender, when auditors traced their origin, they found initial deposits matching currency conversions from the very same banks cited in the Linz Vault papers. One document bore the identical reference code HARB 745. By then, most of the original US Harbinger records had been destroyed. The National Archives file labeled Operation Harbinger 1945-1947 contained only a single page, a receipt stating, "Documents removed under CIC Directive, 12th July 1947. A penciled note in the margin read, "Transferred to War Assets Custodian, Frankfurt." No follow-up record exists. Researchers who probed further into the case found themselves facing a pattern of quiet obstruction. In 1981, journalist Helen Dufresne requested access to CIC files under the Freedom of Information Act. 2 weeks later, she received a call from a retired intelligence officer advising her to let Harbinger rest. When she pressed for details, the man reportedly said it wasn't about treasure, it was about preservation. Dufresne abandoned her investigation and left journalism the following year, but scattered traces remained. A 1952 State Department memorandum, recently declassified, referenced continuing oversight of certain Harbinger assets under corporate custody in neutral territories. Another file, from the Treasury Department, included intercepted correspondence between a Swiss banker and a US military attaché, discussing unresolved transfers tied to CIOS-controlled entities. The memo was classified eyes only, atomic, liaison, suggesting the funds or networks may have been connected to nuclear research repatriation. Among historians, one persistent rumor surrounds the so-called Black Vaults, a second layer of documentation allegedly hidden beneath the Linz site itself. In 1968, Austrian construction workers widening the railway uncovered an underground chamber sealed behind a wall of reinforced concrete. Within were scorched remains of filing cabinets and the twisted frame of a steel crate, bearing the faded imprint Harbinger B2. Local police turned the materials over to American authorities stationed nearby. The site was sealed again within days. Archival cross-references suggest Operation Harbinger may have extended beyond asset concealment into the deliberate smuggling of personnel, patents, and even experimental data into corporate networks that could later be reactivated. A 1946 OSS intelligence summary described it as a transnational continuity framework designed to sustain strategic expertise outside occupied Germany. If true, Harbinger was not an isolated hoarding operation. It was the blueprint for a shadow economy that outlived the war itself. Evidence of its reach appeared again in the early 1960s. West German industrial registries list a sudden surge of chemical and engineering, firms founded by new directors, many sharing surnames with known SS scientists or wartime financiers. When cross-checked against Allied occupation denazification records, several names were missing entirely, suggesting they had been scrubbed prior to review. The most striking case was that of Dr. Erwin Reinhardt, a propulsion specialist who allegedly died in 1945. Yet company filings from 1958 list him as Technical Director of Helios Industry Handel, one of the original Harbinger shell corporations. Reinhardt's signature compared to wartime personnel cards was a match. Even in recent years, faint echoes of Harbinger have surfaced. In 2003, a classified Bundesnachrichtendienst (BND) memo reportedly referenced legacy accounts under codename Harbinger. Residual asset management, dormant. Though heavily redacted, it confirmed that certain financial instruments originating before 1945 remained active within modern European markets, shielded by legal inertia and diplomatic protection. If Operation Harbinger's true objective was to preserve a scientific and financial nucleus of the Reich beyond its military collapse, it succeeded more effectively than any battlefield defense. It bridged wartime Germany and post-war Europe through the language of capital, not ideology. Those who designed it understood that power could survive defeat, provided it changed uniforms. Today, the Linz vault site remains fenced off, monitored by Austrian rail security. Official signage identifies it as maintenance access only. But local residents recall that every few years, foreign inspectors arrive quietly, enter the tunnels, and leave without explanation. What they continue to search for or ensure remains hidden is unknown. In the archives of 3 nations, the story of Harbinger is preserved only in fragments. A burned vault, missing train cars, and unexplained bank ledgers that still yield interest nearly 80 years later. Whatever it was meant to safeguard, Operation Harbinger proved that wars can end while their mechanisms endure, invisible and intact, humming beneath the surface of peace. Chapter 4. The Cold Files of Unit 731 Europe. In the chaotic aftermath of Germany's surrender, Allied investigators stumbled upon anomalies in the Reich's medical archives that made no geographical sense. Crates labeled Erweiterung, Ostasiatische Versuchsreihe, Extension, East Asian Experimental Series, were discovered stacked beneath the ruins of the Luftwaffe Research Hospital outside Munich. The documents inside bore dual insignias, the Reichsadler of Nazi Germany and the Chrysanthemum Seal of Imperial Japan. Each file detailed human trials that mirrored the atrocities committed by Japan's Unit 731 in Manchukuo. The implication was staggering, that a collaboration between Axis medical divisions had extended beyond the boundaries of Asia into the heart of Europe itself. The crates were first catalogued by a Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS team, on September 3, 1946. Lead investigator Dr. Harold Atkinson, a biochemist attached to the US Army Medical Corps, described the discovery in a classified report. Subject materials denote continuity between SS medical research and Japanese bacteriological experimentation, possibly coordinated via diplomatic or scientific liaison through the Reich Ministry of Armaments. The files referenced a program known as Versuchsreihe E, conducted between late 1943 and early 1945 at an installation outside Augsburg. The participants were designated by coded initials, but cross-referencing later revealed several names. Tied to the notorious SS Medical Division, operating out of Dachau, among the most disturbing entries was a project labeled Experiment G12 Resilience, of tissue under freezing vacuum conditions. It involved tests on living prisoners exposed to simulated high-altitude temperatures, combined with bacterial contamination, methods identical to those employed by Unit 731's Harbin branch. Attached photos bore Japanese annotations describing comparative mortality data. One marginal note, written in fluent Japanese and translated decades later, reads simply, "Results confirm Manchurian findings. European subjects behave identically." The initial reaction from Allied scientists was disbelief. The idea that the Reich had directly cooperated with Imperial Japan on biological warfare research across 2 continents seemed improbable. Yet telegrams retrieved from the archives of the Japanese embassy in Berlin confirmed multiple wartime exchanges of scientific personnel under the supervision of Ryoichi Naito, the former deputy of Shiro Ishii, Unit 731's commander. Records showed Naito had visited Germany in late 1944 under diplomatic cover, officially to discuss medical technologies against epidemic disease. In reality, he was accompanied by SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Kurt Heismeyer, known for his tuberculosis experiments at Neuengamme concentration camp. When US occupation authorities began cataloguing these documents, something curious occurred. Within weeks, the files were removed from CIOS custody and reassigned to the newly formed US Army Chemical Corps under Project Paperclip Subdesignation 731E. The official justification: relevance to potential aeromedical and defense applications. When Atkinson tried to locate the files in 1947, he was informed that they had been transferred to Fort Detrick, Maryland, the center of American biological warfare research. He never saw them again. A handful of secondary reports survived only because duplicates had been stored in British archives. One such document, labeled Report H19, detailed a meeting in occupied Prague in January 1945 between German and Japanese officers of the Technical Liaison Mission. Minutes of that meeting record discussion of bacteriological payload dispersal trials using adapted Nebelwerfer ordnance. There was no signature, only a stamped codename Dr. Ishida. Scholars later confirmed the name corresponded to a Unit 731 virologist who disappeared after Japan's surrender and was never prosecuted. Through the 1950s and 1960s, isolated fragments of this transcontinental connection surfaced, only to be rapidly suppressed. During the 1969 US Senate hearings on biological warfare, testimony by a former Fort Detrick researcher briefly mentioned imported data from European tests associated with Japanese wartime projects. The transcript was later amended, and the statement struck from the official record. Yet internal memoranda obtained under the Freedom of Information Act decades later revealed that both the US and British governments had integrated parts of 731E data into early Cold War biological defense programs. In short, evidence derived from human suffering in both Asia and Europe had been quietly recycled into Western scientific development. One German witness, former SS Dr. Wilhelm Rupprecht, testified under oath in 1947 that he had been ordered to replicate Ishii's Manchurian experiments using prisoners from Dachau and Mauthausen. He claimed the data was to be transmitted to our Japanese colleagues for cross-comparison. His statement was dismissed as delusional by Allied prosecutors, and he was later released in 1952 under undisclosed circumstances. Declassified CIC files from 1978 revealed he had been of continuing value to American intelligence. Rupprecht emigrated to Argentina that same year. The Munich site where the original crates were found was bulldozed in 1954, supposedly to make way for civilian reconstruction. Yet a 1972 excavation unearthed a sealed basement chamber containing metal containers labeled Versuchsreihe E3 and E4 radiation. Tests indicated traces of cesium and strontium isotopes, elements consistent with early radiological experiments. A technician on site reported that several containers emitted low but measurable heat, as if chemical reactions continued within. The materials were confiscated by Bundeswehr personnel and never publicly analyzed. Evidence of the cover-up extends into post-war Japan as well. The US occupation authorities granted immunity to many former Unit 731 scientists in exchange for their research data. Internal correspondence from General Douglas MacArthur's staff in 1947 explicitly references data derived from European sources relevant to plague and frostbite. This line, obscure and easily overlooked, likely refers to the Munich or Augsburg archives. The moral compromise was identical. The pursuit of advantage over the Soviets outweighed the prosecution of war crimes. In the 1980s, Japanese historian Keiichi Tsuneshi uncovered what appeared to be a missing link. A 1944 diplomatic telegram sent from Berlin to Tokyo referencing Operation Typhoon Kreuz, a joint medical field collaboration under conditions of shared victory. The message, intercepted by the British but never decoded during the war, remained forgotten until Tsuneshi's analysis decades later. Its full text, once decrypted, described a data exchange mechanism using encrypted submarine dispatches. The submarine I-29, known for carrying sensitive cargo between Japan and Germany, had indeed made such a voyage in 1944 and was sunk by American forces near the Philippines. Among its manifest were sealed cylinders labeled scientific materials, never recovered. By the late 1990s, the faint paper trail of 731 Europe had grown into a dark mosaic of connections between concentration camp doctors, Japanese biowarfare scientists, and post-war intelligence agencies. In 2001, German investigative journalist Anke Weber located an unmarked archival envelope in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Inside were microfilm copies of 5 photographs showing men in SS uniforms and Japanese officers standing before laboratory equipment. The back of one photo was stamped Augsburg, November 1944. The envelope's classification tag, 731E. Every government involved has denied the program's existence. The United States insists that no biological data was acquired from Axis sources beyond Japan. Japan maintains that Unit 731's activities were confined to Asia. Germany's records claim total destruction of all relevant wartime materials. Yet too many converging details persist: the bilingual documents, the parallel experiments, the unaccounted-for scientists who reappeared in Cold War laboratories. Today, the so-called cold files of Unit 731 Europe remain sealed, buried deep in both German and American archives, filed under innocuous designations like Medical Research Liaison, 1946-47. Requests for declassification are repeatedly denied for reasons of public safety. Whether those reasons pertain to the danger of pathogens or the danger of truth remains unclear. What is certain is that beneath the rhetoric of scientific progress and national security lies a shared moral stain, preserved on brittle paper and faded film, testifying to a collaboration the world still refuses to acknowledge. And perhaps that is the final cruelty. That the evidence of these crimes, transferred across oceans and sealed behind layers of red tape, continues to exist, untouched, unread, but alive, pulsing quietly in the cold light of forgotten archives. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Directive of Operation Gladio. When Italy's Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti publicly confirmed the existence of Operation Gladio in 1990, the world learned that NATO had maintained a secret network of stay-behind armies throughout Western Europe. Their official purpose was to resist a potential Soviet invasion, but buried beneath the familiar narrative of Cold War defense lies another, far darker strand of classified history, a substructure that intelligence veterans once whispered about as Directive 9C. This forgotten directive, referenced in fragments of Italian intelligence cables and a handful of surviving NATO memos, points to a clandestine annex of Gladio that operated not to defend democracy, but to manipulate it. The earliest surviving mention of Directive 9C appears in a 1951 memorandum from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, stamped Cosmic Top Secret. It refers cryptically to covert domestic stabilization measures under authority of Allied Clandestine Committee. Annex B, the attached document, now largely destroyed, carried a handwritten marginal note: See Gladio B Protocols, Rome Cell. The term Gladio B would not appear again until the 1970s, when investigative magistrates in Italy began probing the wave of unexplained bombings and political assassinations that had plagued the country for 2 decades. To understand Directive 9C, one must first understand the mechanism of Gladio itself. Funded through the CIA and MI6, organized via NATO's Clandestine Planning Committee, Gladio's operatives were trained in sabotage, communications, and unconventional warfare. Weapons caches were hidden in forests, mountains, and even beneath churches. Each member swore to act independently should the Soviets invade. But the directive that emerged from classified correspondence between 1952 and 1954 transformed this defensive infrastructure into something more insidious. Under 9C, selected operatives were authorized to undertake political neutralization and perception management actions, a euphemism for covert interference in domestic politics. Italian archives declassified in 1999 reveal that during this period, several former Waffen-SS officers and fascist sympathizers were quietly integrated into Gladio's local cells under NATO sanction. Their identities were masked by fabricated service records and new code names. A 1953 memo from the Italian CFAR intelligence agency mentions reintegrated European patriots under coordination of Allied command, with an attached roster of 22 names. One of those names, later matched through handwriting analysis, belonged to Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's famed commando who supposedly escaped post-war prosecution with the help of American intelligence. By 1958, the stay-behind structure had evolved into a network with its own internal economy and agenda. Funding flowed through front organizations like the Atlantic Committee for Civic Cooperation, whose board members included former industrial magnates from the wartime years. Each year, unexplained sums were transferred through Swiss accounts labeled Strategic Cultural Operations. Within NATO, a parallel communication channel known as Phoenix Relay handled 9C-related dispatches, separate from the main Gladio correspondence. Its encryption keys were never shared with national governments, ensuring total deniability. Then came the years of lead. Between 1969 and 1980, Italy suffered a string of violent attacks attributed alternately to far-left radicals and right-wing extremists. The Piazza Fontana bombing, which killed 17 in 1969, became the defining act of the period. Yet investigators soon uncovered anomalies, identical explosive residues appearing across attacks claimed by opposing ideological groups, and suspects who vanished before trial. The pattern was so blatant that in 1984, Italian judge Felice Casson traced the origin of the explosives to NATO stockpiles held under Gladio's jurisdiction. When questioned by Parliament, defense officials invoked state secrecy. It was during Casson's investigation that the first tangible references to Directive 9C surfaced. One declassified cable from the Italian Sismi agency, dated March 1972, warned of unauthorized 9C operations escalating beyond oversight. Another, marked for Allied eyes only, referred to domestic manipulations for the maintenance of political equilibrium. The implication was unmistakable. Elements within Gladio had turned inward, staging or facilitating violence to influence public sentiment, and thereby maintain Western political dominance under the guise of counterterrorism. In 1988, a retired colonel named Luigi Forlani gave a sworn deposition claiming he had attended a 1967 Gladio conference in Brussels, where Directive 9C's provisions were discussed openly. According to Forlani, a NATO liaison officer described it as the strategic management of tension. The colonel's testimony was dismissed by military prosecutors as hearsay, and within months, Forlani was found dead in his car outside Verona, an apparent suicide. His notes, however, survived. Among them was a list of code phrases and meeting dates that matched entries in a NATO planning ledger later released under Belgian parliamentary subpoena. When Gladio was officially exposed in 1990, the public outcry forced several European governments to acknowledge the network's existence, but none admitted to any 9C directive. The CIA's response was categorical. No such program ever existed. Yet one unsealed internal memo from Langley's Directorate of Plans, dated 1954, contains a familiar signature block, Coordination CPD-9C. Its subject line reads, Transfer of European Psychological Action Assets. The rest remains blacked out. Even more troubling are the post-war connections uncovered by contemporary researchers. Documents obtained from the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz show that at least 6 former members of the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the Nazi security service, were later placed in advisory positions within West German intelligence under Allied supervision. 2 of them appear by pseudonym in Gladio training. Rosters dated 1952, their specialization, counterinsurgency and social influence operations. The continuity between totalitarian and democratic clandestine systems becomes impossible to ignore. By the 1970s, Gladio's infrastructure extended across more than 10 countries from Belgium to Turkey. Yet in each case, domestic scandals erupted around the same theme: unsanctioned violence, political destabilization, and systematic obstruction of justice. Parliamentary commissions were launched, only to collapse under diplomatic pressure. The files pertaining to Directive 9C, if they ever existed in full, were either destroyed or locked in NATO's restricted archives at Monsm's requests by member states for access were consistently refused on security grounds. In 2004, an anonymous leak from within Italy's intelligence archives briefly reignited the controversy. A scanned document labelled Directive 9C Allegato 3 surfaced on an encrypted server used by investigative journalists. It contained a chilling passage. In times of ideological polarization, the line between defense and control shall remain deliberately indistinct. Operations are to be disguised as adversarial actions to ensure plausible context. Within days, the document vanished from the network, and the server administrator disappeared from public record. What remains today are scattered traces, cables, rosters, and personal testimonies, converging on one grim truth: that during the height of the Cold War, NATO's invisible army may have engaged in acts of terror to manipulate its own citizens' fears. If Directive 9C truly existed, it represented not a defense strategy but a psychological weapon wielded in the shadows of democracy. The chain of command, if ever reconstructed, would expose a seamless thread connecting wartime fascist officers, post-war intelligence agencies, and modern security structures still operating under layers of classification. Officially, the story ends in silence. The archives in Brussels remain sealed. NATO denies, governments deflect, and witnesses are gone. Yet the pattern of anomalies, the shared explosives, the erased files, the matching code words, points toward a buried mechanism of control that transcended ideology and borders alike. The forgotten directive of Operation Gladio may have been more than an instruction. It was a philosophy that fear could govern more effectively than open war, provided the hand behind it was never seen. In the end, every sealed file and vanished witness leaves a question that refuses to fade. What else lies buried beneath decades of redacted history, in vaults marked declassified, but emptied long before the light could reach them? From the Baltic signals to the missing convoys, from secret medical crates to directives that rewrote democracies, these stories form the anatomy of an invisible war that never truly ended. The last witnesses are gone, but the paper remains, brittle, unsigned, waiting for the next hand willing to unseal the truth history still denies.